The old oak tree stood tall at the far edge of the Mitchell family property, its sprawling branches reaching toward the sky like ancient fingers. For as long as Thomas could remember, that tree had been off limits. Not because it was dangerous or because the fruit was bad, but because Grandpa Harold had made it crystal clear that no one was to go near it. Ever. Thomas grew up watching his grandfather's daily ritual from the kitchen window. Every morning after breakfast, rain or shine, the old man would walk with his slightly bent posture to check on the oak. He'd circle it once, sometimes reaching out to touch the rough bark with a gentleness that seemed odd for his usually gruff demeanor. Then he'd stand there for a minute or two as if having a silent conversation with the massive plant before returning to the house. "Why does Grandpa care so much about that tree?" 8-year-old Thomas once asked his mother as they washed dishes together. His mother glanced out the window where Harold was performing his daily inspection. She sighed and handed Thomas a plate to dry. "That tree's been important to him since before I was born. Some people just get attached to things, honey." But it wasn't just attachment. When Thomas was 10, he and his cousin Ben had been playing catch in the backyard. Ben threw the ball too hard and it sailed over Thomas's head, rolling down the gentle slope toward the oak. "I'll get it," Thomas had called, running after the ball. He was just about to cross the invisible boundary that everyone knew marked Grandpa's forbidden zone when a shout froze him in place. "Stop right there, boy." Thomas turned to see his grandfather moving toward him with surprising speed for a man in his 70s. Harold's face was flushed, his eyes wide with what Thomas would later recognize as fear, not anger. "You know better than to go near that tree," Harold said, his voice quieter now but no less serious as he retrieved the ball himself. "But why, Grandpa?" "It's just a tree," Thomas had asked, genuinely confused. Harold had placed a weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder, his blue eyes, the same color as Thomas's, looking down at him with an intensity that made Thomas feel both important and a little scared. "Some things are better left alone," was all he said before changing the subject. That was the closest thing to an explanation anyone in the family ever got. As the years passed, they simply accepted that the oak was Harold's peculiar fixation. He had even built a small wooden fence around its base, not tall enough to keep anyone out if they really wanted to get in. But a clear message nonetheless: keep away. By the time Thomas entered high school, he barely noticed the tree anymore. It was just part of the landscape of his life, like the creek that ran behind the property or the old barn that hadn't held animals in decades. The family home had been in the Mitchell name for 3 generations, and Thomas loved the sprawling farmhouse with its creaking floors and history in every corner. His grandfather had moved in with them after Grandma Rose died when Thomas was just a baby. Harold had his own room downstairs, which suited him as his joints got stiffer with age. But despite his physical limitations, he never stopped his daily tree checks. Thomas's interest in the forbidden oak reignited the summer he turned 16. He had been helping his grandfather repair a section of fence near the vegetable garden when 2 strangers pulled up the long driveway in a black sedan. "Stay here," Harold said sharply, setting down his hammer with surprising force. Thomas watched as his grandfather approached the visitors, 2 men in button-up shirts who looked official in some way. They spoke for several minutes, with Harold's posture growing more rigid as the conversation continued. At one point, one of the men gestured toward the oak tree. Harold shook his head firmly and his hand movements became more animated. Eventually, the men handed Harold some papers, returned to their car, and drove away. Harold stood watching until the dust from the driveway settled. When he turned back, his face looked 10 years older. "Who were those guys?" Thomas asked when his grandfather returned. "Nobody you need to worry about," Harold answered, but there was a tremor in his voice. That night, Thomas overheard his parents and grandfather talking in hushed tones in the living room. "They can't just take part of the property, Dad," Thomas's father was saying. "They can if the county decides to put the road through," Harold replied. "But I convinced them to survey a different route." "What did it cost you?" Thomas's mother asked quietly. There was a long pause. "More than I wanted to pay, but less than what I'd lose." Thomas slipped back upstairs, more curious than ever. Whatever secret the tree held, it was important enough for his grandfather to fight for. The next morning, Thomas noticed his grandfather had added a padlock to the small fence around the oak. Throughout his high school years, Thomas observed how his grandfather's protectiveness over the tree intensified whenever strangers came to the property. Real estate agents were steered clear of that section of land, Utility workers were closely watched. Once, when a new neighbor suggested that the old oak would make good firewood since it was so massive, Harold had nearly stopped speaking to the man altogether. Thomas's parents seemed to have made peace with the mystery. "Your grandfather has his reasons," his father would say whenever the subject came up. "Some things you just have to respect even if you don't understand them." But Thomas couldn't help his growing curiosity. Sometimes late at night he would look out his bedroom window at the oak's silhouette against the moonlit sky and wonder what power it held over his grandfather. During his senior year of high school, Thomas found an old photo album in the attic while searching for a school project. In it was a faded photograph of a much younger Harold standing next to the oak tree. What caught Thomas's attention was that the tree was much smaller, maybe only 15 feet tall. On the back of the photo, in his grandmother's handwriting, were the words, "Harold and his new oak, spring 1963. So the tree hadn't always been there. His grandfather had planted it himself, around the time he would have been in his late 20s. When Thomas brought the album downstairs to show his mother, her expression grew thoughtful. "I've never seen this picture before," she said, studying it closely. "Dad never talks about his life before he met Mom. I know he moved here from Chicago in the early 60s, but that's about it." That evening, when Harold was watching his favorite Western show on television, Thomas carefully brought up the photograph. "Found an interesting picture today, Grandpa. You with the oak when it was just planted." Harold's hand froze halfway to his mouth with a cookie. For a moment, Thomas thought he saw panic in the old man's eyes. "Where'd you find that?" Harold asked, his voice unnaturally casual. "In an old album in the attic." "Did you plant the tree yourself?" Harold looked at Thomas for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, I planted it. Special variety. Brought the sapling all the way from Illinois." "Why is it so important to you?" Thomas pressed gently. His grandfather's eyes drifted to the window, though the tree wasn't visible from this angle. "That tree marks something significant, Thomas. Something I don't talk about." "Like what?" Thomas leaned forward, hoping this might finally be the moment the mystery was revealed. But Harold shook his head. "When the time comes, you'll understand why some secrets need guarding." He fixed Thomas with a serious look. "Just promise me you'll respect that tree even when I'm gone." The conversation shifted after that, but Thomas couldn't stop thinking about his grandfather's words. What could possibly be so important about an oak tree that it needed lifetime protection? As Thomas prepared to leave for college that fall, he noticed his grandfather spending even more time by the tree. Once, from a distance, he thought he saw the old man digging around its base. But when Thomas approached, Harold quickly smoothed the earth and claimed he was just checking for pests. On the day Thomas left for university, his grandfather hugged him tightly and whispered, "Remember what matters in this family. Land, loyalty, keeping your word." For the next 4 years, Thomas would return home for holidays and summers, and nothing about the tree situation ever changed. If anything, Harold became more protective as his health began to decline. He installed a small bench near the fence so he could sit during his daily visits, and sometimes Thomas would spot him out there talking to the tree, though he could never make out the words. What secret could be so powerful that it commanded such devotion for all these decades? Whatever lay beneath that oak's spreading branches, Thomas began to understand that it was more than just his grandfather's eccentricity. It was something that defined Harold Mitchell's entire life, something he guarded as carefully as the family itself. And despite his burning curiosity, Thomas respected the boundary. Because in the Mitchell family, a promise was a promise, and his grandfather had never asked for much, just that one mysterious, non-negotiable rule: no one goes near the oak tree. Ever. College life kept Thomas busy, but his thoughts often drifted back to the family home and his grandfather's mysterious oak tree. During his sophomore year, a history assignment about family secrets inspired him to dig deeper into the puzzle that had shaped his childhood. When Thomas came home for Thanksgiving break that year, he noticed his grandfather had aged considerably in just 3 months. Harold's shoulders hunched more, his walk had slowed to a shuffle, and deep lines etched his once weathered face. Yet despite his physical decline, his dedication to the oak remained unwavering. "Still checking on that tree every day, huh?" Thomas asked, helping his grandfather button his heavy coat before the morning inspection. Harold's eyes, cloudy with the beginnings of cataracts, fixed on Thomas with surprising sharpness. Some commitments last a lifetime, boy. Thomas walked with him that morning, careful to stay behind the small fence while his grandfather performed his ritual. The November air bit at their faces and frost crunched beneath their boots. You know, Thomas said carefully, I've respected your wishes all these years. Never gone near it. Never asked too many questions. But I'm 20 years old now. Don't you think I deserve to know why this tree is so important? Harold finished his inspection before answering. He sat heavily on the bench, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. It's not about deserving, Thomas. It's about timing. Harold rubbed his gnarled hands together. And about burdens. Some knowledge is a weight you carry. I'm strong enough, Thomas insisted. Harold smiled sadly. That's what I thought at your age, too. He looked up at the bare branches of the oak, now dormant for winter. When the time is right, you'll know. I've made arrangements. Later that day, while helping his mother prepare the Thanksgiving meal, Thomas tried a different approach. Mom, did Grandpa ever tell you anything about the oak tree? Anything at all? His mother paused, knife hovering over an onion. He's always been private about it. Why the sudden interest? It's not sudden. I've wondered my whole life. And Grandpa's getting older. His mother's expression softened. I know, but whatever it is, he's chosen to keep it to himself. Even Dad doesn't know the full story. Before Thomas could respond, the back door opened, and his father and grandfather came in from the garage, carrying extra chairs for dinner. The conversation shifted, but Thomas's questions remained. That evening, after the extended family had gathered for the holiday meal, Thomas noticed something he'd never paid attention to before. When his great-uncle Robert, his grandfather's younger brother, arrived, there was a distinct tension between the two elderly men. They greeted each other with stiff handshakes rather than the hugs exchanged with other family members. Throughout dinner, Thomas observed their interaction. They were polite but distant, speaking to each other only when necessary. Once, when the conversation lulled, Uncle Robert made a comment about the property. Still keeping that old oak, I see, he said, looking directly at Harold. Thought you might have finally gotten rid of it. The table fell quiet. Everyone sensed the undercurrent in his words. Harold set down his fork with deliberate care. The tree stays, Robert. We've been through this. Sure, Uncle Robert replied with a dismissive wave. Just thinking about the family's future. That's all. Thomas's father quickly changed the subject. But Thomas couldn't stop wondering about the exchange. After dinner, while the others watched football in the living room, Thomas volunteered to help with dishes, hoping to ask his great-uncle about the tree. But as he entered the kitchen, he stopped short at the sound of arguing voices coming from the back porch. Through the window he could see his grandfather and Uncle Robert in what appeared to be a heated discussion. Thomas moved closer to the partially open window. It's been over 50 years, Harold, Uncle Robert was saying. No one's coming for it now. Whatever's buried there, it's history. It's not just about what's buried, Harold replied, his voice low but intense. It's about the promise I made. Promises to dead men don't matter anymore. They matter to me, Harold shot back. And they should matter to you, too. You were there, Robert. You know what happened? Uncle Robert sighed heavily. I know you've let this thing control your entire life. For what? Guilt? Fear? It's time to let it go. Never, Harold said firmly. When I'm gone, it'll be handled. I've made arrangements. With who? Uncle Robert demanded. That's not your concern. Harold turned to go back inside, forcing Thomas to quickly move away from the window and pretend to be busy with the dishes when his grandfather entered. For the rest of the break, Thomas watched his grandfather and great-uncle carefully. They avoided each other, and Uncle Robert left a day early, claiming he had other commitments. Before returning to college, Thomas tried one more time to learn the truth. He found his grandfather sitting by the living room window, gazing out at the oak tree in the distance. Grandpa, he said, taking a seat across from him, I heard you and Uncle Robert talking on Thanksgiving. About something being buried under the tree? Harold's head snapped toward Thomas, alarm clear in his eyes. You shouldn't be eavesdropping on private conversations. I know, and I'm sorry. But this has been a mystery my entire life. What's out there? What promise did you make? For a long moment, Harold said nothing. Then he leaned forward, resting his weight on his cane. Come with me. Thomas followed his grandfather outside. The winter afternoon was fading, casting long shadows across the yard. They walked slowly toward the oak, stopping just before the small fence. This tree, Harold said, his voice taking on a distant quality, marks something important, something from my past that needs to stay buried. But what is it? Thomas pressed. Harold looked at him with weary eyes. When I was about your age, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake that could have ruined many lives, including mine. He paused. I found a way to make things right. But part of that meant keeping a secret. Does it have to do with when you moved here from Chicago? His grandfather's eyebrows rose slightly. You've been doing your homework, I see. He nodded slowly. Yes, I came here to start fresh, to live an honest life. And the tree? The tree guards what needs guarding, and reminds me every day of the choice I made. Harold placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. When the time comes, you'll understand why some secrets need keeping. But that time isn't now. Thomas wanted to ask more questions, but the firmness in his grandfather's voice told him the conversation was over. As the years of college passed, Thomas's visits home became less frequent. He called regularly, checking on his parents and grandfather, but internships and summer jobs kept him away for months at a time. His grandfather's health continued to decline, making phone conversations increasingly difficult. During his senior year, Thomas received a call from his father. Harold had suffered a small stroke. He was recovering, but the doctor warned it might be the first of many. Thomas returned home immediately. He found his grandfather in his downstairs bedroom, looking frail against the white hospital pillows they had brought in for him. There he is, Harold said with a weak smile. My college man. Thomas sat with him for hours, talking about school, his plans after graduation, anything to keep his grandfather's spirits up. Harold listened, nodding occasionally, but his gaze frequently drifted to the window that faced the backyard and the oak tree beyond. On the third day of Thomas's visit, a thunderstorm hit. As rain lashed against the windows and thunder boomed overhead, Harold became agitated. The tree, he muttered, trying to push himself up from the bed. Need to check the tree? Grandpa, you can't go out in this weather, Thomas said, gently pushing him back. The tree will be fine. No, lightning. If lightning hits it. Harold clutched at Thomas's arm with surprising strength. Promise me you'll protect it. I promise, Thomas said, hoping to calm him. But why? What happens if the tree is damaged? Harold's eyes, suddenly clear and focused, locked onto Thomas's. There's a letter. In my desk, top drawer. Read it when I'm gone. His grip tightened. Not before. Understand? Not before? Thomas nodded solemnly. I understand, Grandpa. That night, after his grandfather had fallen asleep, Thomas stood at the window watching the storm rage outside. Lightning illuminated the oak tree in brief ghostly flashes. What secret was so important that it needed to be guarded for over 50 years? What burden would eventually pass to him? As he watched, a bolt of lightning struck dangerously close to the tree, making Thomas flinch. The oak stood firm, its massive trunk unyielding against the elements. Just as his grandfather had stood firm against all questions and curiosity for decades. Whatever lay beneath that tree, Thomas realized had shaped his grandfather's entire life and would soon shape his own. After graduation, Thomas took a job at an accounting firm 2 hours away from the family home. Close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to build his own life. Every other weekend, he made the drive back to check on his parents and grandfather. Harold had recovered somewhat from his stroke, but he was noticeably frailer. His once strong hands trembled slightly, and he needed a walker to get around. The daily trips to the oak tree became less frequent as his mobility decreased, but he insisted on making the journey at least once a week, with Thomas or Thomas's father supporting him along the way. You don't have to keep checking on it, Grandpa, Thomas said one Sunday afternoon as they slowly made their way across the lawn. The tree's been fine for decades. It'll be fine now. Harold shook his head stubbornly. Can't stop now. Too important. When they reached the small fence, Harold leaned heavily on his walker and stared up at the massive branches, swaying gently in the breeze. It's still here, he murmured, almost to himself. All these years and it's still safe. What is, Grandpa? Thomas asked quietly. Harold didn't seem to hear the question. He reached out a trembling hand and placed it against the rough bark, closing his eyes as if drawing strength from the contact. On the way back to the house, Harold stopped suddenly. Thomas, he said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. I need you to promise me something. Anything, Grandpa. When I'm gone. Harold paused, struggling with the words. When I'm gone, this place will come to you. Your parents, they don't want it. Too big for them now that you're grown. But you've always loved this land, Thomas nodded. It was true. Despite building his career elsewhere, the family property had always felt like his true home. I need you to promise you'll take care of things. The right way. Harold's eyes bore into Thomas's with an intensity that belied his physical weakness. Of course I will, Thomas assured him. But what's the right way? You'll know. When the time comes, Harold patted his arm. I've made arrangements. There's the letter. He trailed off, looking confused for a moment. Did I tell you about the letter? Yes, Grandpa. In your desk drawer. I'm not supposed to read it until after you're gone. Relief flooded Harold's face. Good boy. He began moving toward the house again. Just remember, Thomas, some burdens can't be shared, not until the right moment. The next year passed with Harold's health continuing its slow decline. He had good days and bad days, but the trips to the oak became increasingly rare as walking grew more difficult. Thomas noticed his grandfather often sitting by the window that faced the backyard, keeping watch over the tree from a distance. One weekend in early autumn, Thomas arrived at the family home to find his mother in tears. Harold had been rushed to the hospital with pneumonia. At the hospital, Thomas found his grandfather looking small and vulnerable beneath the white sheets, an oxygen mask covering much of his face. His eyes lit up when he saw Thomas, and he weakly motioned him closer. The tree, Harold whispered when Thomas leaned down. Don't forget. I won't, Grandpa. I promise. Harold nodded, seemingly satisfied, and drifted back to sleep. For 3 days, the family took turns sitting with Harold. His condition stabilized but didn't improve. On the 4th morning, Thomas arrived at the hospital to find his parents speaking with the doctor in hushed tones outside Harold's room. He's asking for you, his father said, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. He's been in and out, but he was very clear about wanting to see you alone. Thomas entered the room quietly. His grandfather's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow beneath the oxygen mask. Thomas sat in the chair beside the bed and gently took Harold's hand. I'm here, Grandpa. Harold's eyes fluttered open. With his free hand, he weakly pulled the oxygen mask aside. Thomas, he said, his voice barely audible. It's time. No, Grandpa, you're going to get better, Thomas said, fighting back tears. Harold shook his head slightly. My time's done, boy. But yours is just beginning. He squeezed Thomas's hand with surprising strength. The letter. Remember the letter. I remember. Harold's eyes drifted toward the window, though there was nothing to see but the hospital parking lot. The oak has stood guard for over 50 years. Never failed me once. What has it been guarding, Grandpa? Thomas asked, leaning closer. Harold's gaze returned to Thomas's face. For a moment, his eyes were clear and focused as if the fog of illness had temporarily lifted. My redemption, he whispered. Then his eyes closed and he slipped back into sleep. He never woke again. Harold Mitchell passed away peacefully that night at the age of 87, with his family gathered around his bed. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small church where Harold had occasionally attended Sunday services. It seemed the whole town came to pay their respects. Harold had been a quiet man but a well-respected one, known for his honesty and work ethic. Thomas was surprised to see his great-uncle Robert there. The elderly man looked frailer than Thomas remembered, leaning heavily on a cane as he approached the casket to say his goodbyes. As he turned away, his eyes met Thomas's, and a look of understanding passed between them. Later, at the cemetery, Uncle Robert stood beside Thomas as the casket was lowered into the ground. He told you about the tree, didn't he? Uncle Robert asked quietly. Not everything, Thomas admitted. He left a letter. Uncle Robert nodded slowly. That sounds like Harold. Always so careful. He sighed deeply. Whatever he tells you in that letter, just know your grandfather was a good man, better than most, including me. Before Thomas could ask what he meant, Uncle Robert had moved away to offer condolences to Thomas's parents. After the funeral, the family gathered at the house for a small reception. Thomas found himself repeatedly glancing out the window at the oak tree, standing solid and unchanging while everything else in his life seemed to be shifting. That evening, After the last guests had left and his parents had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone in his grandfather's room. The house was quiet except for the occasional creaking of the old wooden floors. Thomas opened the top drawer of the desk and found an envelope with his name written on it in his grandfather's shaky handwriting. For a long moment, he just held it, remembering his promise not to open it until after his grandfather was gone. That time had come, yet Thomas hesitated. Whatever secret the letter contained had shaped his grandfather's life for over 50 years. Once he knew the truth, things would never be the same. Outside the window, the oak tree stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. Thomas slipped the unopened letter into his pocket and went out the back door. The evening air was cool as he walked across the lawn toward the tree. The small fence looked weathered now, the padlock rusted from years of exposure. Thomas stood before it, feeling the weight of the letter in his pocket. "What were you guarding for him?" Thomas asked aloud, looking up at the massive branches. "What was so important that he checked on you every day for most of his life?" The tree, of course, offered no answers, only the soft rustling of its leaves in the gentle breeze. Back in the house, Thomas finally opened the letter. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and the handwriting was steadier than in his final years. This had been written some time ago. "Dear Thomas," it began. "If you're reading this, then I've passed on and left you with questions I never fully answered in life. I'm sorry for that burden, but some stories can only be told once and only to the right person. You are that person." Thomas settled into his grandfather's old chair and continued reading. The letter was several pages long, filled with details about Chicago in the early 1960s, about mistakes made and regrets carried, about a young man who had gotten in over his head with the wrong people, about a secret buried beneath an oak tree. "I've lived my whole life trying to make up for one terrible decision," the letter concluded. "The oak has kept my secret safe all these years. Now that secret and the decision of what to do with it passes to you. I trust you to do what's right, whatever you decide that to be. All my love, Grandpa." Thomas read the letter twice more, trying to absorb everything it revealed. Then he folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. Outside, the oak tree stood as it always had, guardian of a past his grandfather had never escaped. The question now was what Thomas would do with the burden he had inherited. For the next month, Thomas lived in the family home alone. His parents had moved to a smaller place in town years ago, keeping the property for Harold's sake. Now it belonged to Thomas, along with all its secrets. Every morning he found himself continuing his grandfather's ritual, walking out to check on the oak tree. But unlike Harold, Thomas wasn't merely observing, he was deciding. The letter had explained everything. In 1962, Harold had been a young man in Chicago working as a bank teller. He'd gotten involved with a group of men planning a heist, not as a participant but as an inside man who would provide information. He hadn't taken the threat seriously at first, believing they were just talking big. By the time he realized they were serious, he was in too deep. Threats against his family kept him silent. The robbery had gone wrong. A security guard was badly injured, though thankfully not killed. In the chaos, Harold had managed to grab a portion of the money and flee. The other robbers were caught, but somehow never revealed Harold's involvement. Perhaps they didn't know his real name, or perhaps they hoped to find him and the missing money themselves one day. Consumed by guilt, Harold had left Chicago, changing his name slightly from Mitchell to Mitchell. He'd used a small portion of the money to buy the rural property, planting the oak tree over the spot where he buried the rest of the stolen cash. He never touched that money again. It was, as he wrote in the letter, blood money that he couldn't bring himself to spend but was too afraid to return. "Every day I checked that tree," the letter explained, "was another day I reminded myself of my greatest mistake. Another day I chose to be a better man than I had been." Thomas sat on his grandfather's bench, staring up at the massive oak as he turned over options in his mind. He could leave things as they were, continue the daily ritual, keep the secret buried. He could dig up whatever was under the tree and return it anonymously after all these years. Or he could simply pretend he never knew, sell the property, and let the secret remain hidden forever. None of these options felt right. On a crisp fall morning, 5 weeks after the funeral, Thomas made his decision. He would uncover whatever lay beneath the oak. Not to keep it, but to finally bring his grandfather's story to a proper close. The first step was finding someone who could remove the tree. Thomas called several local companies before settling on Wilson's tree service. He was careful not to mention anything unusual, simply explaining that the old oak needed to come down because its roots might be damaging the house foundation, a plausible excuse given its size and proximity. "That's a big job," Pete Wilson said when he came to provide an estimate. He circled the oak, whistling softly. "This tree's been here a long time. Healthy, too. Shame to take it down." "It's necessary," Thomas said firmly. Pete quoted a figure that made Thomas wince, but he agreed. They scheduled the removal for the following week. As the day approached, Thomas grew increasingly anxious. What exactly would they find? How deep had his grandfather buried the stolen money? Would it even still be there after all these years? The night before the scheduled removal, Thomas couldn't sleep. He paced the house, eventually finding himself in his grandfather's room. Nothing had been changed since Harold's death. His clothes still hung in the closet. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the worn quilt. "I hope I'm doing the right thing, Grandpa," he said to the empty room. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Thomas had taken the day off work to oversee the tree removal. At 8 o'clock sharp, Pete Wilson arrived with his crew and equipment. "Last chance to change your mind," Pete said as they surveyed the oak. Thomas shook his head. "It needs to come down." The process was both fascinating and unsettling to watch. The crew worked methodically, first removing the smaller branches with pole saws, then bringing in a bucket truck to reach the higher limbs. By midday, the once majestic oak had been reduced to a tall, bare trunk. "Lunch break," Pete announced. "We'll take down the main trunk after." Thomas nodded, hardly hearing him. His eyes were fixed on the ground around the tree, searching for any sign of disturbance. Nothing was visible yet. The afternoon brought the loudest and most dramatic part of the process. The crew attached cables to the trunk and used a large chainsaw to make precise cuts at the base. The massive trunk crashed to the ground with a thunderous impact that Thomas felt through his boots. All that remained was a stump about 3 feet high and the roots still buried in the earth. Pete approached, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool day. "We can grind that stump down if you want, though it'll be an extra charge. Those roots run deep." "Actually," Thomas said carefully, "I need the roots removed entirely. I'm planning to build on this spot." Pete looked skeptical but shrugged. "Your money. We'll dig out what we can, but those taproots go down pretty far." The crew brought in a small excavator, digging carefully around the stump to expose the massive root ball. As they worked, Thomas stood nearby, watching intently. The afternoon wore on, and the hole around the stump grew wider and deeper. "Hey," one of the workers called out suddenly. "There's something down here." Thomas's heart jumped. He moved closer as the worker pointed at something partially visible among the roots. "Looks like metal," Pete said, frowning. "Old fence post, maybe?" But Thomas knew better. "Keep digging," he instructed, trying to keep his voice steady. Carefully. The worker used a shovel to clear more dirt away. As more of the object became visible, Thomas could see it was a metal box roughly the size of a small suitcase. It had been thoroughly entangled in the roots of the oak, which had grown around and through parts of it over the decades. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete muttered. "What do you think it is?" "Old-time capsule, maybe," Thomas said, the lie coming easily. "My grandfather mentioned something about burying one when he planted this tree." Pete seemed to accept this explanation. "Want us to try getting it out?" "Please," Thomas said, "if you can do it without damaging it." The extraction took another hour of careful digging and cutting through smaller roots. The box was badly rusted and dented in places, but still intact. Finally, they lifted it from the earth, setting it on the ground beside the hole. "Quite the mystery you've got there," Pete said, eyeing the box curiously. "Family heirloom," Thomas replied with a forced smile. "Thank you for being so careful with it." After settling the bill and watching the crew load their equipment, Thomas was finally alone with the box. It was heavier than he expected when he tried to lift it. Whatever was inside had substantial weight. The padlock that once secured it had rusted beyond use, its mechanism seized by decades underground. Thomas found a crowbar in the garage and, with some effort, pried the lid open. The inside of the box was surprisingly well preserved compared to its exterior. Thomas stared at the contents, his breath catching in his throat. Neatly stacked inside were bundles of cash, the bills faded but still clearly recognizable. They were secured with old rubber bands that had long since lost their elasticity, crumbling when Thomas touched them. Beside the money lay several small cloth bags. Opening one carefully, Thomas found it contained gold coins. Another held what appeared to be diamonds, though he couldn't be sure without an expert's opinion. Tucked into the corner of the box was a manila envelope. Inside, Thomas found yellowed newspaper clippings about the bank robbery, including photos of the men who were caught. His grandfather wasn't among them. At the very bottom of the box was another envelope, smaller than the first, with Thomas written on it in his grandfather's handwriting, different from the letter he'd already read. With trembling hands, Thomas opened it and unfolded the single page inside. "If you're reading this," it began, "you've made the decision I never could. The money was stolen from First National Bank of Chicago on October 3rd, 1962. I've never spent a penny of it. My share was $43,000, a fortune then, probably still substantial now. The jewels and gold came from the safe deposit boxes. They've weighed on my conscience every day since. I've lived an honest life in every other way, trying to make up for this one terrible mistake. Now the decision falls to you. Whatever you choose, I trust it will be the right thing. I love you, Grandpa." Thomas sat back on his heels, staring at the open box as the afternoon sun began to set. The oak tree that had stood guard for so long now lay in pieces around him. His grandfather's secret was finally unearthed. Now he had to decide what to do with it. Thomas didn't sleep that night. The metal box sat on his grandfather's desk, its contents spread out before him as he weighed his options. The cash was old and some bills showed signs of mildew, but most were still in decent condition. The gold coins gleamed in the desk lamp's light, and what he assumed were diamonds caught the light with each turn. By morning, he had made his decision. His first call was to his parents. "I need to tell you something," he said when his father answered. "Something about Grandpa. Can you and Mom come over today?" When they arrived, Thomas led them to the backyard where the remains of the oak tree lay scattered. "Thomas, what have you done?" his mother gasped. "Your grandfather loved that tree." "Grandpa wasn't protecting a tree," Thomas said gently. "He was protecting a secret." Inside, he showed them the box and the letters. His parents read in stunned silence. "I had no idea," his father finally said, shaking his head. "All these years, did you ever suspect anything?" Thomas asked. His mother wiped away tears. "He was always so honest in everything else, so careful with money. We thought the tree was just an old man's quirk." "What are you going to do?" his father asked. Thomas took a deep breath. The right thing. His next call was to his great-uncle Robert. The old man arrived that afternoon, moving slowly with his cane. "So you found it," Uncle Robert said when Thomas showed him the box. "It wasn't a question." "You knew all along," Thomas replied. Robert lowered himself carefully into a chair. "I suspected. Harold never told me directly, but I was there in Chicago when he suddenly decided to leave town. Then I visited him here and saw how protective he was of that tree." He sighed heavily. "I told him to let it go all these years, that no one was looking anymore. Why didn't you tell anyone?" "He was my brother," Uncle Robert said simply, "and he was trying to make it right in his own way. Living an honest life, never touching the money. That counted for something." Thomas nodded slowly. "I need to know, were you involved in the robbery?" Uncle Robert shook his head firmly. "No. I had my suspicions afterward, but I wasn't part of it. Harold got mixed up with some bad people. By the time he realized how serious they were, he was in too deep." He looked up at Thomas. "What will you do now?" "I've already started," Thomas replied. The following day, Thomas drove 2 hours to the nearest FBI field office. He had called ahead, saying only that he had information about an old bank robbery. The agent who met him, a woman in her 40s named Agent Diane Powell, listened without interruption as Thomas explained the situation and showed her the letters. "Let me understand this correctly," she said when he finished. "You're saying your grandfather was involved in a bank robbery in Chicago in 1962, kept his share of the stolen money buried for over 50 years, and now you're turning it in?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "Everything's in my car. The money, the jewels, the newspaper clippings, everything." Agent Powell studied him. "You realize you could have kept this? After all this time, no one was looking." "My grandfather spent his whole life guarding this secret," Thomas said. "It was his burden. I don't want it to be mine." The process that followed took months. The FBI verified the robbery through their cold case files. First National Bank of Chicago had long since been acquired by another bank, but records of the heist still existed. The total stolen had been just over $175,000, a significant sum in 1962. Harold's share, plus the items from the safe deposit boxes, would be worth considerably more today. As the investigation proceeded, Thomas learned more about the case. The other robbers had served their time and were either deceased or elderly men who had rebuilt their lives after prison. The injured security guard had recovered and passed away in the 1990s. No charges would be filed against Harold posthumously, and Thomas faced no legal consequences for turning in the money. Throughout the process, Thomas was surprised by how little regret he felt. The money had never been his, and keeping it would have meant carrying the same burden his grandfather had borne for decades. 6 months after cutting down the oak tree, Thomas received a call from Agent Powell. "The case is officially closed," she told him. "The current bank has decided not to pursue recovery of the funds after all this time. They're actually donating the full amount plus interest to the security guard's family foundation as a goodwill gesture. They'd like to acknowledge your honesty, if that's okay with you." "No acknowledgement," Thomas said quickly. "I'd prefer to remain anonymous. This was my grandfather's story, not mine." "I understand," Agent Powell replied. "There is one more thing. The items from the safe deposit boxes. The owners or their heirs have been traced for most of them, but there are a few pieces that remain unclaimed. Legally, after all this time and considering the circumstances, those items could be released to you if you wanted them." Thomas thought about it for a moment. "No," he finally said. "I think it's better to make a clean break. Donate them too, if possible." After hanging up, Thomas walked outside to where the oak tree had once stood. The hole had been filled in, the wood cleared away. Next spring he planned to plant a garden there, something new and hopeful. His phone rang again. It was Uncle Robert. "Just checking in," the old man said. "How did it all shake out with the feds?" Thomas told him about the bank's decision and the donations. "Harold would have liked that," Uncle Robert said after a long pause. "He always wanted to make it right somehow." "Do you think he ever found peace?" Thomas asked. "Checking on that tree every day, carrying that secret for so long?" "I think," Uncle Robert said slowly, "that he found as much peace as a good man with one terrible mistake can find. He built a life of honesty to make up for one moment of weakness. That counts for something." After they hung up, Thomas sat on the bench his grandfather had used for his daily vigils. The property felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a shadow had been lifted. Next week, his parents were coming over to help him clear out Harold's room. They had suggested turning it into a home office, since Thomas was now working remotely most days. As the sun began to set, Thomas took out the last piece of his grandfather's legacy, a faded photograph of young Harold standing next to the newly planted oak tree in 1963. He had kept this one item for himself. In the photo, his grandfather looked both younger and older than his years, a young man with ancient eyes, standing beside a sapling that would grow to become his daily reminder of both shame and redemption. Thomas had the strange thought that in some ways, he and the oak tree had served the same purpose in his grandfather's life. They were both things Harold had nurtured, watching them grow straight and true despite their complicated beginnings. A week later, Thomas received a letter from the security guard's family foundation. They didn't name him specifically. Agent Powell had kept her word about his anonymity, but they expressed profound gratitude for the unexpected donation that would fund scholarships for children of security officers for years to come. "Your honest actions have turned something painful into a force for good," the letter concluded. Sometimes the best endings come from the most difficult beginnings. Thomas framed the letter and hung it in what had been his grandfather's room, now his office. Beside it, he placed the photograph of young Harold with the oak sapling. In the spring, Thomas planted a garden where the oak had stood. Nothing grand, just wildflowers and vegetables in a circular patch. His mother suggested adding a small bench nearby. "For when you want to sit and think," she said, "like Grandpa used to do." On the bench, Thomas installed a small brass plaque. It didn't bear Harold's name or any explanation, just a simple inscription that only Thomas and his family would truly understand. From one mistake came a lifetime of honesty. From buried secrets grew a legacy of truth. Every morning, Thomas found himself continuing a version of his grandfather's ritual. He would walk out to the garden, check on the growing plants, and sit for a moment on the bench. Not out of obligation or to guard a secret, but to remember a complicated, flawed, and ultimately good man who had found his own path to redemption. The weight Harold had carried for decades had finally been lifted. His secret was no longer buried beneath the soil but transformed into something healing and hopeful, just like the garden that now grew where the guardian oak once stood.